The morning Louisa Shepard scraped the last of the cornmeal into her children's bowls and turned away so they would not see her own empty plate. She told herself she was not crying, that it was only the smoke from the stove getting into her eyes. The town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail in the year 1878, a place where cattle drives rolled through like thunder on dry ground, where cowboys were as common as tumbleweeds and just as likely to blow through without stopping. It was a town that did not particularly concern itself with the suffering of one widow woman and her 3 children living on the far eastern edge of a quarter section of cracked, stubborn earth. The land had belonged to her husband, James Shepard, before a fever took him 14 months ago, leaving Louisa alone at 31 years old with 3 children, a leaking roof, a mule named Patterson who had opinions about everything, and debts that seemed to grow taller than corn ever would on that difficult ground. Her children were Nora, who was 9 and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's particular stubbornness, Thomas, who was 7 and had decided at some point that frogs were the most important creatures God had ever made, and little Clara, who had just turned 5 and still sometimes called out for her papa in the night before remembering, and the remembering was always the worst part. Louisa had made a system of it. She rose before the children, built the fire, portioned out what food remained, and gave them each a proper breakfast, biscuits when there was flour and fat enough, cornmeal mush when there was not, and twice a week she managed an egg from the 3 hens they still kept. She gave them lunch too, something simple, whatever she could make stretch. And at supper she filled their plates and told them she had already eaten, or that she was not hungry, or she invented some other small, quiet lie and watched them eat and felt a desperate, complicated love for them that was almost painful in its intensity. She ate once a day herself, usually late at night after they were all asleep, and she ate whatever was left, which was often very little, and she told herself it was fine, that she could manage, that come spring things would be different. But it was October now, and things were not different. The crop she had attempted in her husband's absence had been meager. The soil on their parcel was hardpan clay in places, too dry in the summer and too wet in the brief spring to cooperate with her inexperienced hands. She had traded what little she could spare at the general store in town run by Mr. Holt, a decent enough man who had extended her credit twice already and had recently done so a 3rd time with an expression on his face that she recognized as pity, which was far worse than impatience would have been. She had her pride. Lord, she had her pride. It was perhaps the most durable thing she owned. She had considered writing to her sister in Missouri, but her sister had 4 children of her own and a husband who barely kept them above water, and Louisa could not bring herself to add another stone to that particular pile. She had considered selling the land, but the thought of it made something in her chest close up tight, because it was the last thing that connected her children to their father, and she could not do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So she kept on. She made do. She mended clothes until the mending was more thread than original fabric. She boiled bones twice for soup. She gathered what wild herbs she knew from the creek bottom. She did laundry for Mrs. Caldwell, not the town's namesake, just a banker's wife who shared the name, and she sewed buttonholes for Mrs. Greaves at 50 cents per dozen, and she took in whatever small work came her way. It was not enough. Walter Dalton did not consider himself a complicated man. He was 36 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual work rather than any vanity about it, with brown hair that had some gray coming in at the temples now, which his ranch hand Emilio always teased him about mercilessly. He had been running the Dalton spread 2,000 acres along the southwest edge of Caldwell for 8 years, since his father had passed and left it to him. He ran cattle, good longhorn stock, and sold them at the railhead. He employed 6 men year-round and another 4 during drive season. He was not rich by the standards of the great Texas cattlemen, but he was comfortable, and more importantly he was honest, and the land was in good shape, and his hands were paid fair wages and knew it. He had been briefly engaged once, 7 years ago, to a woman named Alina who had decided that Kansas was simply not the life she had imagined and had gone back to her family in Cincinnati, and that had been that. He did not blame her. Kansas could be brutal in ways that were not always visible until you had lived through a full year of it. He had simply gone back to his work and let the years accumulate the way dust accumulates in corners, quietly and without particular drama. He came into town every Thursday to collect mail, pick up supplies, and drink one glass of whiskey at the Silver Star Saloon, which he considered a reasonable weekly indulgence. He was not a man who gambled, not a man who sought trouble, and the trouble that occasionally found him he handled quietly and went home. It was on a Thursday in early October that he first properly saw Louisa Shepard, though he would later realize he had probably passed her on the street a dozen times without really looking. He was coming out of Holt's General Store with a bag of coffee and some wire when he nearly walked directly into her. She was carrying a basket of laundry on one hip and had Clara on the other, and she was trying to negotiate the step down from the boardwalk without dropping either one, and her face had that particular expression of a person concentrating enormously on a small logistical problem, because if they stopped concentrating on small logistical problems, they might have to think about the larger ones. He stepped aside quickly. She said, "Pardon me," without really looking at him, and got down the steps successfully and kept walking. He might not have thought more about it, except that he went into the store and Holt was still at the counter with his ledger open, and something about the open page and the way Holt's expression shifted made Walter glance at it, and he saw her name there. He would not ordinarily have been the sort of man to read another person's financial ledger. But the page was open and the numbers were plainly visible, and what he saw was a column of small credits: laundry, 50 cents, buttonholes, 40 cents, egg trade, 15 cents, against a column of debits that had been building since before last winter. And at the bottom of the page, in Holt's careful hand, the notation, 3 children. Walter bought his coffee and his wire and he walked home the long way, which took him past the eastern edge of town and then out past the smaller homestead parcels. And when he came near the Shepard place, he slowed without fully meaning to. The house was small and weathered, the kind of house that was holding itself together through sheer stubbornness. There was a kitchen garden that had gone to dry stalks now that autumn had come, but he could see from the spacing of it that someone had planted it carefully, thoughtfully, and had worked it hard. There was a mule in the small paddock and 3 hens and a pile of firewood that was not going to be enough for winter. He could see that from the road. And there were the children, the older girl and a boy chasing something across the yard that was probably a frog given the season, and the little one sitting on the porch step with something in her lap. He did not stop. He kept walking, but he was thinking. He was still thinking about it the next morning over his own breakfast, which Emilio's wife Carmen cooked, and which was, as it always was, generous and warm and plentiful: eggs, salt pork, biscuits, gravy. The kind of breakfast that a man could take entirely for granted if he was not paying attention, and Walter found himself paying a particular kind of attention this morning that he had not bothered with before. He asked Emilio casually, who owned the small parcel out east, the one with the weathered house and the kitchen garden. Emilio, who was 42 and had been in Kansas since the early cattle days and knew everything about everyone within 20 miles, leaned against the fence post and said that it was the Shepard widow. Said her husband had died the previous year of fever, said she had 3 children, said she had been trying to work the land herself, but it was hard ground and she was a woman alone, and there was not a lot of give in this part of the territory for women in that position. Walter listened to all of this and then asked if she had family, and Emilio said he did not believe so, not nearby. He rode his property lines that afternoon, which he did regularly and which always had a calming effect on him, and he thought about what a man did with a thing like this. He was not her family. He had barely met her. He had no claim to her situation, and she had not asked for his help, and a woman with that much pride would probably receive an offer of charity about as warmly as a rattlesnake receives a boot heel. But a woman eating one meal a day so her children could have two, and he had somehow known that was what was happening, had read it in the thinness of her face and the particular set of her jaw, and the way she had kept moving even when everything about her posture suggested exhaustion. A woman doing that was not a problem that could be politely ignored. He slept badly. In the morning he had a plan, of the rough kind, which was the only kind that usually worked. He rode into town and found Holt and asked, without preamble, what the Shepard account stood at. Holt looked uncomfortable and said it was not strictly his business to share another person's accounts. Walter said he understood that, and then he put enough money on the counter to cover whatever the amount was plus a reasonable margin, and he said he wanted to put it against her credit, anonymous, and that Holt was not to tell her who had done it, and he wanted the credit to cover staples: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, beans, lard, sugar, and anything else the woman asked for through the winter. Holt looked at the money and then at Walter, and said that was more than the debt and then some. Walter said, "I know, that is the point." He felt better riding home, but not entirely settled, because there were other problems that money put on a ledger could not solve. The firewood situation, for instance. The roof situation. He had seen from the road that 2 shingles on the south side were warped badly enough to cause leaks. The general situation of a woman and 3 children going into a Kansas winter without adequate provision. He came back the following Tuesday with 2 of his hands, Cruz and a younger man named Billy Beaumont, who was 19 and good-natured about most tasks assigned to him. He had a wagon loaded with split firewood, enough to fill a proper cord, and a bundle of new shingles. He had thought very carefully about how to approach this. He had decided that honesty, presented practically and without sentiment, was the only approach that had any chance of not being immediately refused. He drove up the lane to the house, and Louisa came to the door and looked at the wagon and then at him, and her expression was not welcoming. It was the expression of a woman who had learned to be cautious about things that appeared to be good fortune. He took his hat off. "Mrs. Shepard," he said, "I am Walter Dalton. I run the spread southwest of town. I apologize for arriving without notice. I have some firewood I would like to leave with you, and my men and I could have those 2 shingles on the south side replaced in under an hour if you would allow it." There was a silence. She had brown hair pulled back with several loose strands around her face, green eyes that were assessing him with the particular intelligence of a person who could not afford mistakes, and she was thinner than she should have been. He could see that clearly now, up close. But she stood in that doorway with a quality about her that he could only describe as dignified, even in her worn dress and her bare feet on the porch boards. "I do not know you, Mr. Dalton," she said, "and I cannot accept charity from someone I do not know." "It is not charity," he said, which he had prepared for. "It is a proposition. I need someone to sew new curtains for the main house of my ranch. My housekeeper, Mrs. Vargas, has been after me about it for 2 years, and I keep not having anyone to do it. I am told you do sewing work. I will pay fair for it. The firewood and the shingles would be an advance on that work." She studied him for a long moment. He met her gaze steadily and did not look away because he felt that looking away would suggest he was not being honest, and he was, well, partly. He did actually need curtains. He had asked Carmen Vargas about it just that morning, and she had laughed at him and said yes, for the love of all that was holy. The curtains in the parlor were practically translucent. Louisa looked at the wood. She looked at her 3 children who had appeared at various points around the yard and were watching this exchange with open interest. Thomas was still holding a frog. Clara had attached herself to her mother's skirt. "What would you pay for curtains?" Louisa asked. $2 a window," he said. "I have 8 windows in the main house that need them." He watched her doing the arithmetic, $16, and watched something shift in her face, not gratitude, not yet, something more complex than that, and he understood that this was a woman who was used to being the one who managed things, and that accepting help, even help disguised as a transaction, cost her something. "All right," she said after a pause that felt significant, "but only because I need the work, not because of anything else." "I understand that," he said, and he did. Cruz and Billy unloaded the wood and stacked it properly against the side of the house, while Walter replaced the shingles, which were in worse shape than he had seen from the road. One of them was actually cracked through, and the underlayment beneath it was soft from moisture. He took his time and did it right, and at one point he heard the older girl, Nora, appear at the base of the ladder and ask him what he was doing. He told her he was replacing shingles. She asked how he knew how to do that. He told her his father had taught him when he was not much older than she was. She considered this information, found it acceptable, and went back to whatever she had been doing. He came down the ladder and found Louisa standing in the yard with a cup of coffee. Not for him, he understood. She was holding it herself, the way people hold hot drinks when they are trying to appear calm and settled when they are perhaps not entirely either. "Those shingles were ready to give way," he said. "You would have had water through the ceiling before December." "I know," she said. "I was going to see to it." He believed she would have tried. He did not say anything else about it. He told her he would have the fabric for the curtains brought by within the week, along with measurements. She nodded. He thanked her for her time, which was a slightly formal thing to say given that she had not particularly given him any, and he collected his men and his wagon and drove back toward his ranch. On the way back, Cruz, who was 45 and had been with Walter since the beginning and said whatever he thought with the efficiency of a man who does not believe in wasting breath, looked at him sideways and said, "She is very pretty." Walter said, "She is a widow with 3 children who needs her roof fixed." Cruz said, "Both things can be true." Walter did not respond to that, but he was aware that Cruz was right, which was an inconvenient thing to be aware of. He brought the fabric that Friday. It was good cotton, a blue and white stripe that he had found at Holt's. Carmen Vargas had come with him and selected it, because he had no idea what made good curtain fabric and Carmen was not willing to let him embarrass himself. He also brought, somewhat obliquely, a basket that Carmen had packed, which contained among other things a roasted chicken, 2 dozen biscuits, a crock of butter, a jar of apple preserves, and a small wheel of hard cheese that had come with the last cattle buyer from Missouri. Carmen had not asked him anything about who the basket was for. She had simply packed it with the thoroughness of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and approved of it. He left the basket on the porch with the fabric while Louisa was out in the back, and he knocked on the door frame and waited until she came around the side of the house. And he explained that Carmen had sent food along with the materials, because Carmen always did this when he came to discuss work with anyone, which was true enough though the usual basket was considerably smaller. Louisa looked at the basket and he braced for the refusal, but she looked instead at the children, Thomas, who was tugging at her hand asking what was in it, Clara, who had already somehow identified the smell of roast chicken and was pressing forward, Nora, who was pretending she was not interested but was very clearly interested. And Louisa looked at her children, and something in her face shifted from proud resistance to something quieter and more complicated, and she said, "Please thank Mrs. Vargas for her kindness." "I will," he said. He gave her the measurements and they discussed the fabric briefly, and she asked if there was a particular style of curtain he preferred, and he said he did not have a preference, and she smiled at that. Just a small, quick smile, the first one he had seen from her, and it did something to the general atmosphere of the afternoon that he would have had difficulty describing but which he felt clearly. He came back 2 weeks later to collect the finished curtains, which were folded neatly and tied with string, and they were better than he had expected. The stitching was even and careful, and she had used the fabric efficiently, so there was very little waste. He paid her the $16 and added 2 more, explaining that the window in the study was larger than the measurement he had given her, and the additional fabric made up the difference. The window was not, in fact, larger, but he had measured it twice, and it had seemed like a legitimate explanation. She counted the money carefully. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was partway between suspicion and something warmer, and she said, "You have been very decent to us, Mr. Dalton." "You did good work," he said simply. "Would you like to stay for supper?" She asked, and he could tell from the slight hesitation before it that the invitation surprised her as much as it did him. He thought of what supper at her table might look like, what she would have available to offer a guest, and he thought of the arithmetic of it, and he said, "I appreciate that, Mrs. Shepard. I would be glad to, if you let me contribute something." He had brought another basket from Carmen, slightly smaller this time, with the explanation pre-prepared that Carmen sent one with him whenever he had business calls in the afternoon because she worried about him skipping meals, which was also true. Louisa took the basket this time without argument, and there was something in that small shift, the absence of refusal, that felt like progress of some kind, though he was not yet sure progress toward what. Supper was at a wooden table in a kitchen that was small and clean, and had the smell of bread and wood smoke and something herbal he could not identify. The children ate with the specific enthusiasm of children who had been given more than they were accustomed to. Thomas talked about frogs with a depth of knowledge and passion that Walter found genuinely impressive. Nora watched Walter throughout the meal with an evaluating look that was remarkably similar to her mother's. Clara ate her biscuit in small, deliberate pieces and then fell asleep against her mother's arm before the meal was finished. Louisa put Clara to bed and came back to the table and poured him coffee, real coffee, he noticed, from the supply he had put on at Holt's, and they sat in the kitchen while Nora and Thomas were dispatched to their bed, and they talked for a while. He asked about her husband, and she talked about James Shepard with a plain, honest grief that was neither performed nor hidden. A man who had been kind and hardworking and not particularly lucky, who had come out to Kansas believing the land would yield to him if he was good enough to it, and the land had not cooperated, and then the fever had come. Walter talked about his own father, who had built the ranch from 30 acres with a stubbornness that would have impressed anyone, who had taught him that land did not owe you anything, and that the only way to make it work was to work harder than it did. They talked about the homestead situation, about how the Timber Culture Act was not exactly delivering on its promises for smaller claims, about the particular difficulty of farming hardpan clay, and Walter found himself saying, without particularly planning to, that if she was interested, he could have his man Emilio look at her soil and tell her what it needed, because Emilio had grown up in New Mexico and knew more about difficult ground than anyone Walter had ever met. She looked at him with that direct green gaze and said, "Why are you doing this, Mr. Dalton?" He considered telling her it was because he found her impressive, which was true. He considered telling her it was because the situation was unjust and he had the means to do something about that, which was also true. He decided on the simpler truth that did not require defending. "I came into Holt's the day I almost ran into you on the boardwalk," he said. His ledger was open. "I saw your account." He paused. "I saw the notation about 3 children. And I have been a rancher my whole life, and I know what a person looks like when they are going without so others do not have to, and you looked like that. And it seemed to me that it did not have to continue if someone was willing to do something practical about it." There was a long quiet after that. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Outside the wind was picking up the way it did in October. "That credit at Holt's," she said slowly, "that was you." He had told Holt to keep it anonymous. He should have known that Holt, while a decent man, was not particularly good at keeping things fully anonymous in a town this size. He did not deny it. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment that was not exactly comfortable. He waited. "I do not know how to repay that," she said. "I am not sure I can." "It was not a loan," he said. "There is nothing to repay." Then what was it? He thought about this. It was one person deciding that another person and her children were going to eat properly through the winter, he said. "That is all." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were folded around her coffee cup, and her hair had come loose from its pin on one side, and there was firelight on her face, and she looked, he thought, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had just been told that she did not have to carry it alone. "You are a strange man, Walter Dalton," she said. "I have been told that before," he said. She smiled again, the real kind, not the quick, polite one. This one reached her eyes. He thought it was a remarkable smile, and that it changed her entire face, and that he would like very much to see it regularly, which was a thought he set aside for later consideration. He rode home under a clear October sky with stars thick as spilled sugar, and he was thinking about green eyes and the particular quality of courage it took to be a woman alone in Kansas in 1878 with 3 children, and not one word of complaint. After that first supper, he found reasons to come by the Shepard place. Not every day, not even every week at first, because he was not a man who did things without consideration, and he was aware that a widow with 3 children had enough complications without a rancher conducting himself without thinking. But he came when it was reasonable. He had Emilio come out to look at the soil as he had promised, and Emilio spent 2 hours walking the land with Louisa, and then produced from his accumulated knowledge a practical prescription involving turning the east section and adding composted material and planting a specific mix of crops. And he said it with such confidence and clarity that Louisa had asked him to repeat the whole thing so she could write it down. Emilio had ridden back to the ranch with Walter that evening and said nothing for nearly a mile before saying, "She will do well. She has the right kind of thinking about land." Walter said that was good to hear. Emilio said nothing else but smiled at the road in a way that Walter found unnecessary. He asked Louisa if she would allow him to bring her a spare mare from his spread, explaining that Patterson the mule, while clearly opinionated, was not well suited to breaking and working new soil. The mare, whose name was Copper and who was a gentle, steady chestnut, had more than enough sense for the kind of field work Louisa needed. He explained it as a loan. The mare could board at her place through spring in exchange for the work, and he would have no call to keep her penned idle at the ranch through winter. Louisa accepted this with a straight face that was nonetheless doing something complicated around the corners. "You are very good at making things sound like they benefit you," she said. "I try," he said. She laughed at that, a real laugh, and he thought it was one of the best sounds he had heard in recent memory. November came, and with it the first real cold. Walter found himself thinking about the Shepard place during the work of each day in a way that had become too consistent to ignore. He thought about whether the firewood was holding up. He thought about whether the repairs he had made to the roof were fully sound, or whether there was something else that needed attending to. He thought, with some frequency and without entirely meaning to, about a particular laugh, and the particular way a certain pair of green eyes caught the light in a dim kitchen. He was not a man who generally ignored information that was relevant to a situation, and this was relevant information, and so he spent some days in early November examining it honestly. He had been alone for a long time, which was a circumstance he had been mostly at peace with. He had his work, which he valued. He had good men around him. He had the land. He had enough. He had simply never met someone who occupied his thoughts the way Louisa Shepard was beginning to occupy them. There was also the practical and entirely real consideration that she was a widow with 3 children, and had been through considerable difficulty, and the last thing she needed was a man pursuing an attachment without genuine intention, or without taking seriously what such a thing would mean in her specific circumstances. He thought about it until he had thought it through cleanly, and then he went to see her again. It was a Wednesday, not his usual Thursday, and she was in the kitchen garden when he rode up, doing the late autumn cleanup of the dead stalks. The day was cold and gray, and she had her coat on. The brown one that he had noticed was fraying at both cuffs, and her cheeks were red from the cold, and she looked entirely alive in a way that made something in his chest do a thing he had not felt in a long time. He got down from his horse and helped her with the garden work without being asked, because she was clearly working hard at it and there were two hands to do it or one, and two made more sense. They worked in a companionable quiet for a while, and then she said, "You did not bring anything today." "I did not come to bring anything today," he said. She looked up from the row she was clearing. "Then why did you come?" He straightened up and looked at her directly. He had decided that if he was going to say something, he was going to say it plainly, because she was a plain-speaking woman who would not appreciate anything else. "I came because I wanted to see you," he said. Not for any practical reason, just that. There was a moment of the kind of silence that has weight to it. She stood up and brushed dried soil from her gloves and looked at him with that green gaze that was doing the thing it always did, which was seeing considerably more than he felt comfortable with. "My situation is complicated, Mr. Dalton," she said. "Walter," he said. "I think we have established enough of an acquaintance for Walter." "Walter," she said. "My situation is complicated. I have 3 children. I have debt and difficult land, and I am not what any man would describe as an easy prospect." "I did not say I was looking for an easy prospect," he said. "I said I came to see you." She was quiet for a moment. "I liked my husband," she said, which was an unusual way to phrase it, but which he understood she meant with real feeling. "I grieved him properly, and I am done with that grief. But I am not sure I am the kind of woman who can afford to feel things that might not." She started again. "I do not want to be careless about my children." "That is fair," he said. "I am not asking you to be careless about anything. I am asking if I may call on you properly and spend time with you and see where that leads. That is all. If it leads nowhere, we are neighbors and you have a standing line of credit at Holt's and the loan of a good mare, and I am still the man who came to fix your shingles. None of that changes." She considered him for a long time. The wind moved through the dead garden stalks and made a dry rustling sound. "All right," she said. "You may call on me." "Thank you," he said, "but you should know," she added, "that Nora already has opinions about you. Good or bad." "She has not decided," Louisa said. "She takes her time, which means you will need to be patient." "Patience is something I have a reasonable supply of," he said, and so he called on her. He came on Sundays when the work of the week was done, and sometimes on a Wednesday afternoon if things were quiet enough at the ranch to allow it. He came and helped with the practical work of the homestead when help was needed, and she was willing to accept it, which she was, more easily now, though she was very clear that she was keeping track and intended to be square with him when circumstances allowed. He told her there was no need, and she told him there was every need, and they reached a compromise in which he agreed to let her keep track, and she agreed to stop arguing about it for the present time. He learned her properly, the way you learn a person when you are paying attention. He learned that she made decisions by going very quiet and looking at a middle distance that did not exist, that she read anything she could get hold of. He started bringing her books from the small library he had built at the ranch, and she went through them with a speed that impressed him. He learned that she sang to Clara at night old songs he half recognized from somewhere, and that her voice was low and sweet and not particularly trained. He learned that she had strong opinions about politics, specifically about the treatment of homesteaders by the cattle interests, which put him in the interesting position of being both the object of her regard and a representative of the cattle interests. And they had conversations about it that were lively and honest, and that he enjoyed enormously because she did not soften her views on his account, and he respected that unreservedly. He learned that Thomas's frog expertise was genuine and extensive, and that the correct response to being told about frogs was to ask follow-up questions, which Walter did sincerely because he found Thomas's particular brand of passion for the subject genuinely charming. He learned that Nora was watching him with the eye of someone who had decided that her mother had been through enough and was not going to let anything else happen to her if Nora could help it, and he treated this with the seriousness it deserved, which meant that when Nora eventually asked him directly what his intentions were, she was 9 years old, and she used those exact words with a gravity that would have done credit to a circuit judge. He told her honestly that he intended to care for her mother and her family if they would let him, and that he had no intention of being anything but good to all of them. Nora had looked at him for a long, evaluating moment and said, "All right. But I am watching." He told her he expected nothing less. He and Louisa had the habit, when he came on Sunday evenings after supper when the children were in bed, of sitting in the kitchen with coffee and talking until late. These conversations had a quality to them that he did not have adequate language for. They were easy in the way that meant he never felt the need to perform or qualify, that he could say what he actually thought, and she would take it seriously and respond from her own honest thinking. She made him laugh regularly and genuinely, which was something he had not particularly expected and which he found delightful. One evening in late November she told him about the night James had died, the fever that had come on fast, the terrifying helplessness of watching a person you loved simply leave despite everything you could do. She told it simply and without dramatization, and he listened without trying to fix it or diminish it. And when she was done, he said that he was sorry, and meant it the way you mean something when you have genuinely sat with it. She said, "You have not had anyone in a long time." It was not a question, but he answered it. 7 years or so. "Is that lonely?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "It was not until recently," he said. She looked at him with the firelight on her face and the kitchen quiet around them, and he thought that he was gone entirely, that there was no part of him that was not already committed to this woman in a way that could not be undone, and that it felt not like falling but like arriving somewhere he had not known he was headed. "Walter," she said, and there was something different in the way she said his name now, something that had not been there in October. "Yes," he said. "I think I might be in some danger of caring for you rather a great deal," she said, with the particular manner of someone stating a fact they are still getting used to. He looked at her steadily. "I am already there," he said, "so you are not in any danger of being there alone." She looked at her hands and then back at him, and she said, "This is terrifying." "Yes," he agreed, "it is." She laughed at that, slightly unsteadily, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she looked at it and turned her hand over and held his in return, and they sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen while the wind moved around the house outside, and he thought that he had never been so glad of anything as he was of having almost walked into her on a boardwalk in October. December came in cold and definitive, and Walter threw himself into making sure the Shepard place was as ready for it as possible, which involved a second round of repairs to the west-facing wall where he had found a gap in the chinking, and bringing over a second load of firewood from his own woodlot, and consulting with Emilio about the timing for turning the east field in spring. He also, around this time, had a conversation with Louisa about the land itself. He had been thinking about it for weeks, and had finally organized his thinking into something practical. He told her that the eastern parcel she held was not the best ground for the kind of farming she was attempting alone, but that the creek section along its southern edge was good bottomland if it was worked right. He told her that he had a grazing license on the adjacent BLM land, and that if she was willing, she could run 4 or 5 head of cattle on that bottomland as part of a shared grazing arrangement that would give her beef income through the year without requiring all the capital of a full herd. She listened to all of this carefully and asked several excellent questions about the logistics of it, and then she said, "You have been planning this for a while." "Some time," he admitted. "You think about my land quite a bit," she said. "I think about you quite a bit," he said. "Your land comes with that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, to the cattle arrangement, under conditions we negotiate properly." "Obviously," he said. They did negotiate it properly, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper between them and Louisa writing things down in a careful hand, and asking every question that needed asking, and he thought watching her that she would have made a formidable businesswoman in any circumstances, that the particular quality of her mind precise, not credulous, accustomed to looking past the surface of things, was one of the things he valued most about her. Christmas that year was different from any Christmas Walter had spent in recent memory, most of which had been spent quietly at the ranch with his men, and which he had been content enough with. Louisa came to the ranch with the children for Christmas dinner, which was Carmen Vargas's doing. She had invited Louisa directly, which Walter found out about after the fact when Louisa mentioned it, and he had looked at Carmen with an expression that she met with perfect innocence. Carmen had cooked for 3 days. The table in the ranch's dining room was set with genuine care. There was a turkey and a glazed ham and 3 kinds of vegetables and fresh bread and a pie. And Thomas ate with a dedication that made Emilio laugh out loud, and Clara fell asleep in an armchair before the pie was served, and Nora had a long conversation with Cruz about horses, during which Cruz came away, Walter noticed, looking somewhat awed by her. Walter gave Louisa a gift. He had wrapped himself badly in brown paper, a set of good quality writing materials, ink and quality paper, and 2 good pens, because she had mentioned once that she had been a reasonable correspondent before circumstances had reduced her to writing on whatever scraps were available, and he thought she deserved to write on something proper. She looked at the gift for a moment and then looked at him and said nothing, and he understood that she was managing something in herself that she was not ready to put into words, and he did not push. Before they left that evening, she stood with him for a moment on the porch while the children were collected and coats were found, and she said, quietly, "I think next Christmas might look different from this one." He looked at her. She met his eyes with that clear green gaze and the cold air around them and the stars above and the quiet of the winter night, and he said, "I hope so." She looked as though she was about to say something more and then changed her mind, and simply stood close to him for a moment, their shoulders almost touching in the cold, and it was a quieter and more eloquent thing than any speech. January and February were the hardest months, as they always are in Kansas, with cold that arrived with a particular Kansas intention that was different from merely being cold and more like being personally argued with by the weather. Walter came by when the roads allowed, and when they did not he sent Cruz or Emilio to check on the house and bring supplies, and he wrote Louisa letters, which he had not done for anyone in a very long time, and which he found, to his own surprise, came to him readily. She wrote back. Her letters were better than his. She had a quality of precise description that made him feel he was standing in the kitchen looking at whatever she was describing. And she was funny in her letters in a way that made him laugh at his kitchen table in the early morning before the day's work, which was a new and good way to start a day. In one letter she wrote about Thomas, who had been very seriously unwell for several days with a bad cold that had settled in his chest. And the fear in that letter was plain, and Walter had read it twice, and then saddled his horse, and ridden out through 6 inches of February snow, without particular concern for the difficulty of it. He arrived to find Thomas pale and coughing, but improved from the worst of it, and Louisa at the kitchen table with the particular gray look of someone who had not slept in 2 nights. He sat down across from her, and she looked at him, and he understood that she had been managing the fear alone, the way she managed everything alone, and that it had cost her more than she was showing. He said, "He is going to be all right." "I know," she said. "I know. But when James—" she stopped. "When James got the fever, it also started with a chest cold, and for about 4 days I was not thinking clearly." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held on to it harder than she usually allowed herself to. And he thought about how much this woman had carried, and for how long, and what it cost to carry it. And he felt something fierce and tender in equal measure that he had no adequate word for, but which he recognized as the kind of feeling a man builds his life around if he is fortunate enough to have it. He stayed through the afternoon, helped with the fire and the supper, read to Clara and Thomas from one of the books he had brought, and when it was late and the children were settled and Thomas was sleeping soundly and his breathing was easy, he finally stood to go, and Louisa walked him to the door. He had his hat in his hands, and she was looking at him in the way she had been looking at him for some weeks now, which was different from how she had looked at him in October, and different even from November, something that had developed its own specific quality that he was very aware of without having been able to quite address. "You rode 6 miles through snow," she said. "The horse did most of it," he said. "Walter." She said his name with the full weight of it, everything that had been accumulating between them for 4 months, and he stood in the open doorway in the cold night and looked at her, and she looked at him, and she stepped forward and kissed him. It was brief, and not particularly complicated, and entirely the most important thing that had happened to him in many years. He kissed her back with care and with honesty, and with the specific intention of a man who knows exactly what he means by it. When she stepped back, he was still holding his hat, and the winter night was perfectly quiet around the house, and she was looking at him with her eyes very bright. "I have been thinking about doing that for some time," she said. "So have I," he said, "though I was trying to be patient." "How patient were you planning to be?" she asked. "I was not certain," he admitted. "Longer than this, probably." She laughed, and he thought he could spend the rest of his life being the reason for that laugh without growing tired of it. He rode home through the cold night, in a state that he recognized as happiness of a particular and irreversible kind. March came, and with it, the first suggestions of spring and the beginning of the practical work of turning Emilio's recommended fields. Walter came out on several mornings to help with the turning, which was hard work but satisfying, and Thomas helped with the enthusiasm of a boy who had discovered that turning soil revealed excellent worm quantities, which were of secondary interest to him only in the context of what they attracted. Louisa was working with him one afternoon when she stopped turning soil and leaned on her tool handle and said, looking out at the field, "I want you to know that a year ago I could not have imagined any of this." He stopped too and looked at her. "The field." "All of it," she said, not struggling so hard, the children actually having enough, feeling like she paused, feeling like the future is something to look forward to rather than something to simply get through. He said, "I am glad." She turned to look at him. "It is because of you. I do not say that to create an obligation or imply one. I just want you to know that I know it." He thought about this for a moment. "It is not because of me," he said. "It is because of you. You were already doing everything right. You just needed someone to hand you a little more ground to work with." She considered this. "That is a kind way to put it." "It is an honest way to put it," he said. She smiled at him across the turned earth, and he thought, not for the first time, about something more permanent, about something he had been thinking about with increasing clarity since February. He had been letting it sit and settle, making sure it was real and not just the shape of the feeling, and he was as sure of it now as he had been of anything in his adult life. He waited until an evening in April when the weather had turned warm enough to sit on the porch after supper, when the children were in bed, and the April sky was showing all its depth above the dark flat Kansas land, and he told Louisa that he wanted to marry her. He said it plainly, because she appreciated plainness, and he said all of it, not just the question but the reasons and the intentions behind it, that he wanted to give her children a stable and provided-for life, that he wanted to work the land alongside her, that the ranch and the homestead between them made sense as a combined operation, and that all of that was real and true, and also almost incidental to the main fact, which was that he loved her, and that was the primary and irreducible reason he was asking. She was quiet for a long time, in the way she got quiet when she was thinking through something seriously. He waited because she had asked for patience early on, and he had said he had a supply of it, and he meant that. "The children," she said, "they are not a separate consideration." "I know," he said, "they have never been separate. They are part of what I am asking about." "Nora," she said, "Nora has been watching me since October," he said. "I have done my best to be worth watching." She almost smiled. "And Thomas. Thomas has taught me more about frogs than I knew was possible," he said. "I consider it an education. And Clara fell asleep on my arm at Christmas," he said. "I considered that a good sign." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I have been married before. I know what it is. I know what it can be, and I know that it is not a small thing and that it can be lost and that the losing is." She stopped. "I need you to know that I am not entering this lightly. If I say yes, I mean it completely." "I know that," he said. "That is one of the reasons I am asking you and not someone else." She turned to look at him in the April dark, and he could see her face clearly enough to see what was in it, which was not just an answer to a question but a whole reconfiguration of something, the settling of a decision that had the weight of a genuine life commitment behind it. "Yes," she said. "Walter, yes." He took her hand. She leaned against him in the April evening with the stars coming out above the flat Kansas sky and the last light dying in the west and the sound of the land around them. Their land, both parcels and all the work and future they represented. And he thought that he had never in his life been so entirely at peace with a moment. They were married in June, at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, which was a small white building with a bell tower that worked inconsistently but rang correctly on that morning. Carmen Vargas wore her good dress and cried from the front pew. Emilio stood straight and solemn as a ceremony required, though Walter had seen him grinning broadly at the church steps before the service. Cruz had polished his boots to a remarkable standard for the occasion. Billy Beaumont had picked wildflowers from along the creek road and given them to Nora, which she had accepted with the dignity of someone who was managing very strong feelings about the general situation. Thomas wore his good shirt and had successfully left all frogs at home, which Louisa had presented as a serious prerequisite for his attendance, and which he had accepted as the reasonable cost of the event. Clara wore a white dress that Carmen had made for her, and was extremely pleased about every aspect of this from start to finish. Louisa wore a dress the color of dusty blue that she and Carmen had worked on together for 2 months, and her hair was properly pinned, and her eyes were clear and bright, and she walked down that aisle with Nora and Thomas on either side of her, and Clara ahead throwing dried flower petals with the committed enthusiasm of a 5-year-old. And Walter watched her come toward him, and thought that whatever he had done in his life to arrive at this particular morning, he was grateful for all of it. The Reverend read the words, and they said what needed to be said, and when he was told he might kiss his bride, he kissed her gently, and she kissed him back in the church, which contained most of the people either of them knew in Caldwell, made a warm and satisfied sound. There was a reception at the ranch afterward in the yard, because the yard was large enough and the June day was perfect for it. Carmen and 2 of the women from town had cooked enough for 3 times the number of guests, and the table stretched long under the shade of the cottonwood Walter's father had planted 30 years ago, and Thomas ate with his characteristic dedication, and Nora eventually stopped managing her feelings and was seen to be genuinely and broadly smiling, and Clara fell asleep under the table, and was found there by Emilio, who carried her inside without waking her. Holt from the general store came and shook Walter's hand, and told him the account that did not exist had been the best investment Walter had ever made, and Walter said that was an accurate assessment. Walter had built a 2nd room onto the ranch house in the spring, and Louisa and the children moved into the ranch, the homestead parcel retained for the cattle operation, and the kitchen garden and the field Emilio had prescribed, which was planted that spring and showed every indication of producing something real. Patterson, the mule, was integrated into the ranch's working animals with approximately his usual quantity of opinions. The summer was full and good. Walter and Louisa worked the ranch and the homestead as the combined operation he had envisioned, and it ran with a satisfying logic that made practical sense, and that also simply made sense in the way that 2 people working alongside each other, who are genuinely well suited to each other, makes sense. He watched her become more fully herself, watched the exhaustion of the prior years give way to something else, not ease exactly, because they both worked hard and the land required it, but a different quality, grounded and sure. She laughed more. She read more, working through his library at a steady pace, and then starting on the Caldwell Public Lending Collection, and then ordering books through the dry goods catalog. She had opinions about everything she read, and told them to him in the evenings with an intensity that he found endlessly interesting. Nora, by August, had stopped watching him and started talking to him, which he recognized as a significant shift in her assessment. She was interested in the cattle operation and had a particular aptitude for it that Walter brought to Louisa's attention, and Louisa said she was not surprised, that James had always said Nora had the best instincts of the family for animals. Walter began taking her with him on the stock checks, which she approached with the same evaluating seriousness she had brought to watching him since October. Thomas and his frog studies had expanded into a general interest in natural history that Walter, on a trip to Wichita in September, addressed by finding a copy of a natural history compendium at a bookseller there and bringing it back, and Thomas had read the relevant sections within a week and produced several annotations that he had written in the margins with complete confidence. Clara had attached herself to Carmen Vargas with a thoroughness that Carmen found entirely satisfactory, and the kitchen at the ranch became a place where Clara spent a great deal of her time learning, with enormous seriousness and some genuine skill, the things that Carmen was willing to teach. The fall brought the cattle sale at the railhead, which went well better than the previous year. The prices were up, and the stock was in excellent condition, and Walter came home from Wichita with the sale settled and the account in good order, and found Louisa in the kitchen with the lamp lit and coffee on, and a letter open on the table that she handed to him with an expression he could not immediately read. The letter was from her sister in Missouri. The sister had written before, but this letter was different. It carried a lightness in it that the previous letters had not, a response to something in Louisa's recent correspondence, her sister saying she had never heard Louisa sound like this, that she had been worried for the past 2 years, and that reading her recent letters had lifted a weight she had been carrying. Louisa watched him read it, and when he was done she said, "She wants to come visit in spring." "That would be good," he said. "It would," she said. "I have missed her." He set the letter down and looked at her across the kitchen table, and she was watching him with that particular expression she had developed over the months, warm and direct and entirely its own thing, and he said, "You are happy." It was not a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes," she said, "I am happy, genuinely and specifically and in ways I can name." She paused. "I'm happy about the land and about the children. I'm happy about Carmen's kitchen and about the books. I am happy about the summer we had." Another pause. "I am happy about you, most particularly about you." He got up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood, and he held her for a moment in the kitchen while the lamp flickered and the October wind moved around the house, and she leaned into him with the whole weight of herself, and he thought that this, exactly this, was what all the years of work and patience had been for. He said into her hair, "I want to tell you something." She leaned back to see his face. "When I almost walked into you on that boardwalk," he said, "I almost kept walking. I almost went back to the ranch and let it go. I had a reason not to look too closely at someone else's situation." She waited. "I am glad I looked," he said. "I am grateful every day that I looked." She put her hand against his face and looked at him with those green eyes and said, "So am I. That winter was nothing like the previous one. The house was full and warm and properly provisioned, and the children were fed and well and growing in the way children grow when they have enough of what they need." Walter had ordered new coats for all 3 of them from the Wichita catalog, and when they arrived, Thomas had tried his on immediately and worn it for the entire day, including inside the house. Nora had looked at hers for a moment with the expression she had when she was managing strong feelings, and then thanked him with a dignity that told him everything. He and Louisa had developed the rhythms of a genuine life together, the early mornings with coffee and the practical talk of the day, the division of work that made sense, the evenings with the children and then the evenings after the children, the quiet conversations and the less quiet ones about politics and land rights, and the treatment of the smaller homesteaders by the cattle interests, which remained a live topic between them, and which Walter had come to agree with her about more thoroughly than he had anticipated, partly because she was right and partly because living alongside someone who was directly affected by those injustices changes the abstract quality of the argument. He was aware of how the deck was stacked against smaller homesteaders, people who had come west with the government's encouragement and promises only to find that the economics of large operations like his own put pressure on them from every side: land prices, water rights, grazing access, the simple fact that a large operation had the capital to weather a bad year when a small one did not. He had always been broadly aware of it. Living with Louisa made him specifically aware of it, and he began doing things that he had the position and standing to do, speaking plainly at town meetings, backing certain homesteader claims before the county committee, using his relationship with the larger cattle interests to push back on the most aggressive boundary practices. It did not fix the fundamental situation, which was structural and would take many years and many voices to address, but it was the responsible use of the position he held. Spring came, and with it Louisa's sister Margaret, who arrived on the stage from Wichita with her husband Robert and their youngest 2 children, and the ranch was briefly and happily full of a degree of population that made Emilio raise his eyebrows and Carmen produce quantities of food that impressed even Thomas. Margaret and Louisa spent 3 days in a state of talking that the rest of the household understood to be necessary and important, and gave them space for. Walter liked Margaret, who had the same directness as her sister and who looked at him, at the ranch, at the children's obvious condition, and at Louisa's particular quality of settled happiness, and who said to him privately on the second evening while they were both standing on the porch that she had been afraid for Louisa and that she was no longer afraid. He said he was glad. She said, "You are what she needed. Not someone to rescue her, she is quite capable of managing herself, as I expect you know by now she is," he said. "But someone to stand alongside her," Margaret finished. "That is what she needed, and you understood that." He thought about that for a while after Margaret and Robert and their children had gone back to Missouri, thought about what it meant to stand alongside someone versus standing in front of them, and thought that Louisa had probably taught him more about the distinction than he had brought to it himself. That same spring, the East Field produced its first proper yield. The combination of Emilio's soil prescription and Louisa's disciplined planting, and the rainfall, which cooperated that year in a way Kansas rainfall does not always bother to, resulted in a crop that cleared their expenses and produced a genuine small surplus. Louisa stood at the edge of the field in late August looking at it, and Walter stood beside her, and she said, "James planted this field 3 times and got almost nothing." "The ground needed what Emilio told it," Walter said. "The ground needed someone who knew what it needed," she said. "That is different from the land itself being bad." She turned to look at him. "I want you to know that I intend for this land to be worth something, not just useful, properly worth something, for the children." "I know," he said, "it will be. I am going to make it so," she said, in a tone that made absolutely clear she was not expressing a hope but stating a plan. He smiled. "I know," he said again. November of that second year brought something that Walter had hoped for and had not wanted to press, because he understood it was a decision that had its own timing. Louisa came to find him in the barn one afternoon, where he was checking the shoe on one of the working horses, and she waited until he had finished, and then she said, in a matter-of-fact tone that was covering something rather larger, that she believed she was expecting. He set down the horse's hoof and straightened and looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was partly uncertain, and partly something bright and carefully managed underneath the uncertainty. He crossed the barn floor and she met him in the middle of it, and he held her and she held him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying that the holding did not cover. Then he said, "How do you feel?" "Frightened," she said honestly. "Good, frightened and good in about equal measure." "That seems right," he said. She pulled back to see his face. "You are pleased." "I am entirely, completely pleased," he said. "Are you?" She considered it honestly, which was how she considered everything. "Yes," she said, "I am. Once the frightened part settles down enough to let the rest of it through, yes." She told the children at supper, and Thomas immediately asked if the baby would be interested in frogs, and Nora said that was too early to know, and Clara asked if the baby could sleep in her bed, and Louisa said there was time before they needed to arrange anything. Walter watched them around the table and thought about the year before this one and the year before that, the empty plate turned away from, the smoke that was not smoke, the thin face on the boardwalk, and the distance between that morning and this evening at this table with this family. And he was aware of something that was gratitude in the most uncomplicated and sincere possible form. The spring of 1880 brought a son. He arrived in April, which was fitting given what the previous April had produced between his parents, and he was a healthy and insistent and dark-haired boy who arrived in the world with a definite opinion about it. They named him James Walter Dalton, James for the man who had loved Louisa and worked this land before either of them had thought about the other, and Walter because it had been Louisa's suggestion, and she had been firm about it. The naming of the child James was a conversation that Walter had not been certain how to have, and which turned out not to require having, because Louisa had come to it herself and explained it to him in the kitchen one evening before the birth. She said that she did not believe in erasing what had been. She said James Shepard had been a good man who had loved his family and tried his best, and deserved to be remembered with respect, and not with the particular awkward silence that sometimes attended the first husband of a remarried widow. She said that their son carrying his name was not a complication, it was a recognition. And she said she hoped Walter understood that. He said he understood it, and that he thought she was right. Nora, who was now 11 and had opinions about most things, said at the naming that she thought it was exactly correct. Thomas said he approved of the name James. Clara said the baby's hair looked like mud, which was intended as a positive observation. James Walter Dalton was, from his arrival, the subject of considerable attention from his older siblings. Thomas brought him frog-related information at intervals that Walter considered ambitious given the child's age. Nora held him with the seriousness of someone who had been appointed to a responsibility they took fully to heart. Clara told him at length about Carmen's kitchen, which Clara was now genuinely helping in, and which she described with the passion of someone who had found their calling. Walter held his son in the evening sometimes, in the rocking chair that had been his mother's and that had stood in the parlor without much use for years, and he was aware of a fullness to things that he had not expected, and could not entirely explain, except that it was the difference between a life that was good in the functional and practical sense, and a life that was inhabited all the way to its edges. Louisa healed well and was back at her usual activities faster than he thought entirely wise, and had to be reasoned with about this, which she accepted with limited patience, and which he did not press too hard because he had learned where her limits were, and also because she was right that she was fine. The summer was full. The ranch work ran well, the east field produced again, better this year, and the cattle operation had expanded modestly in the way Walter had planned. He hired a young man from a neighboring homestead as a second full-time hand, a 22-year-old named Samuel who turned out to have excellent instincts for cattle work, and who Nora informed within the first week of his employment that she had opinions about the way he was handling the sorting gate, and who had the sense to listen to her. There was a town meeting in September about the water rights question, which had been building for 2 years and which involved the larger cattlemen on one side and the homesteaders on the other, and which had the potential to become genuinely ugly. Walter spoke at the meeting in a way that surprised several of the larger landowners, who had expected him to be fully on their side, and who found instead that he spoke for a compromise arrangement that acknowledged the homesteaders' needs, and that he backed with a practical proposal, involving the creek access schedule that he had worked out with Louisa and Emilio over the previous weeks. It did not resolve everything. These things did not resolve everything in a single meeting in 1880 Kansas, but it moved the situation in a direction that was less damaging, and several of the homesteader families came up to him afterward with expressions that meant more to him than the approval of the larger operators. Louisa had been in the meeting. She came to him afterward and stood beside him while people were dispersing and said, quietly, "You did a good thing." "There was a right answer," he said. "It was not complicated." "It was complicated for some of the people in that room," she said. "Then they needed to think more clearly," he said. She took his arm as they walked out into the September evening, the main street of Caldwell with its Thursday activity, the cattle hands and the storekeepers and the families, the whole running complexity of a frontier town in a particular moment of the West, everything in motion and nothing entirely settled. And she held his arm and walked beside him, and he thought that whatever was not settled in the world around them, what was settled between them was completely and honestly and permanently so. That October, Louisa planted bulbs along the south side of the ranch house. She had ordered them from a catalog in the spring Dutch bulbs, tulips and daffodils, and she planted them in the October ground with the patience of someone who understands that some things take a winter to come good. Walter watched her from the porch and thought about October 2 years ago, the boardwalk, the basket that was not charity, the shingles on a roof that needed fixing. She looked up from the planting and saw him watching and said, "What are you thinking about?" "A mule named Patterson," he said. She laughed. "That is a very specific thing to be thinking about." "He had opinions," Walter said. "I respected that." She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the afternoon light on her face and the turned earth around her and said, "I think about that October sometimes, about how close it came to going differently." "It did not go differently," he said. "No," she said. "It did not." She looked at the garden bed with its newly turned earth. "You know what I think about most, not the big things. Not the credit at Holt's or the firewood, though those things they were everything, Walter. I want you to know that. But what I think about most is that you came to the garden. That day in November. You just helped with the garden without making it complicated. I think that is when I knew." He came down the porch steps and crossed the yard and crouched beside her in the garden bed, and she looked at him with the green eyes that had assessed him so carefully since the beginning and were so completely open now, and he said, "I think I knew on the boardwalk. I was just slower about admitting it." She kissed him there in the dirt of the garden bed with the October sky above them, and the smell of turned earth around them, and the sound from inside the house of Clara, recounting something at full volume for the benefit of anyone within range. And it was perhaps not the most decorous moment, but it was entirely theirs, and it was exactly right. The bulbs came up the following spring, April, the same month James Walter had arrived and the same month Walter had asked for her hand, and they were yellow and red and white along the south side of the ranch house. And when Louisa saw them, she stood at the kitchen window in the morning light and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "There, there," he said. "That is what this place looks like when it is ours," she said. He stood beside her at the window and looked at the spring garden and the spread of land beyond it, the east field already showing green with the early planting, the cattle at the creek fence, the sky above Kansas in April with its particular quality of blue, and he thought about what it meant to have made a life from careful work and honest feeling, about the woman beside him who had stood in a doorway in October and held her ground with a quiet dignity that had changed everything. James was in the kitchen with Clara, who was teaching him, at 14 months, the correct way to stir something in a bowl, with the result that there was considerable flour in places that were not the bowl. Thomas had come in from checking the creek and left his boots at the door as required, and announced that the frog population along the south bank was, in his assessment, excellent. Nora was already in the barn, had been up before breakfast to check on the mare that was due to foal. Walter put his arm around Louisa's waist and she leaned into him, and the house was full of sound and life, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and flour and wood smoke. And outside the spring light was on the yellow tulips and on the good Kansas earth. And he thought that a man who had almost walked past a boardwalk without looking was perhaps the most fortunate man in the county. He said, "How many children do you think is enough?" She considered this with the expression she had for practical questions. "I am not sure," she said. "I will let you know when I have one more thought on the matter," he said. "Fair enough." She turned from the window to look at him fully. "Walter," she said. "Yes. The year before you found out," she paused. "I told myself I was managing. I told myself that I was fine and the children were fine and that I did not need—" She stopped again. "You were managing," he said. "I was barely managing," she said honestly. "And I had gotten so used to being barely that I had stopped being able to see it clearly. You saw it when I could not see it myself. You would have found your way," he said, and he believed it. "Maybe," she said, "but I did not have to because you looked." She put her hand against his chest in the old gesture, the one she had developed over 2 years of knowing him. "I think about that a lot, about what it means that one person simply looked." He covered her hand with his own, and she held his gaze with the full weight of everything they had made together, the land and the children and the years ahead and all the ordinary, extraordinary mornings that would fill them, and she said, "I am grateful, every single day." "So am I," he said. "Every one." Outside, the spring continued on in the way it does in Kansas when it decides to cooperate, which is abundantly and without restraint. The grass coming green and the creek running full, and the cottonwood putting out its new leaves in that specific bright green that is only ever April green. And the ranch ran, and the field grew, and the children were fed and well and known and loved. And every morning Walter Dalton rose before the sun, and started the fire and started the coffee, and stood for a moment in the kitchen of a house that was fully and completely a home. And he thought about what a difference a boardwalk made, and an open ledger page, and one person deciding that something needed to change tonight. And every morning Louisa came down the stairs to the warm kitchen, and the coffee already made and her children sleeping still above her. And she stood in the kitchen of the ranch house that was her house now, with the spring light coming in the east window and the sound of the land around them and no empty plate. Not anywhere. Not for anyone. Not ever again. And she thought about what it meant to have been seen at exactly the right moment by exactly the right man. And she was glad of it every morning. And the mornings were very good.